guys. So, me and Anna did chapter 3 out of our textbook. Our chapter was on responsive classroom management. It talked about how you can incorporate CLR into your classroom, how to assess your classroom management plan that you have in place, and knowing the difference between cultural behaviors in your classroom versus straight up inappropriate behaviors in your classroom. So, as the educator, you have to assess the quantity and quality of the current classroom management system that you have in place. CLR practices are meant to enhance management plans that are struggling. CLR is not meant to replace an ineffective classroom management plan. So what this is saying is that you can incorporate CLR practices only after you assess your current classroom management plan. And you need to find the parts of it that need to be touched up on or adapted to incorporate the CLR into those, because just putting in CLR practices randomly throughout your plan, like it says, will not replace an ineffective classroom management plan. Your management plan has to be effective from the start before you can incorporate the CLR. So there are some steps in this assessment of the current classroom management plan that need to be completed. And our author of the books, Holly, says that there are undeniable intangibles that have to be present to have an effective system. Now, these start our 3 R's. Now, the 3 R's are also the first step of assessment of your current classroom management plan prior to incorporating CLR. So, the 3 R's have to be present in order to have an effective system. As teachers reflect on classroom management issues, it is important to be aware of their relationships with their students. Now, the first R in the 3 stands for rapport, which is the special connection between students and teachers that leads to a mutual understanding based on concern and care for one another. Now, that is exactly what it sounds like. It's the connection that you build with your students. That way you have that mutual understanding with each other, that everyone in the classroom cares for each other, and that helps build your community in the classroom. Now, the second is relationship. Teachers who build a solid relationship with students are trusted. This trust gives the teacher and students freedom to manage the behavior that's unwanted because of the mutual trust. So this is saying that when the teacher has this trust with the students, it makes them want to maybe listen to him or her more. It helps the teacher redirect behavior because the student will want to listen to that teacher if they trust them, because they know that they have their best interest in heart. This also liberates teachers and students to be whoever they needed to be in any given moment. So this trust between the teacher and student will send social cues in a way for the teacher to know if they need to be more of a counselor for their student, if they need to be a friend for that student, maybe they need to be a mom figure for that student. Whatever it needs to be, this trust helps the teacher know when to be that person for the student, and the same goes for the student. They will know when it's time to learn, when it's time to listen, when it's time to stop talking, things like that. This trust will help each other in the long run. The third R for respect is based on teachers' ability to convey knowledge with understanding and sensitivity to the audience. Students need to be confident that the teacher can teach. So the first criterion for respect is the fact that the teacher needs to be able to convey their knowledge to their students in a way that they're going to understand. Underserved students often lose ability in their teacher's ability to teach. So if the student doesn't think that you know what you're talking about, or doesn't think that you believe in what you're talking about, they're not going to believe you, and they're going to have a hard time listening to you because they just don't think that you're going to know what you're saying. So a quote that I put in here that really ties together all of this is that they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that is also a reason why respect needs to be in place, that way that the other R's can work. So respect needs to happen, that way you can build a rapport and build a relationship with your students. The second step of assessment, remember that this is the assessment of your current classroom management plan before incorporating CLR. So the second step is knowing the school of thought. This assessment calls on teachers to know the general management school of thought they aspire to be compared to what actually occurs. So these are the 3 most common schools of thought. The first being authoritarian. Now, this is where the teacher is literally in charge and the primary control of the classroom rests on him or her. So this is more of the traditional philosophy of teaching, like we saw in the videos of the old school teaching where it's just the teacher in the front and the students are in the desk, and it's whatever the teacher says, whatever the teacher does, the students do with little feedback or instruction. The second school of thought is permissive. This is where the students are in control of the classroom in a way that is typically negative, and this tends to create tension within the public school because when the students are in control, we all know that the students wouldn't have proper ways of organizing, of managing the classroom. They need some kind of structure and control in their life. And that's why the book describes this permissive classroom as a lose-lose scenario, because neither students or administrators or teachers benefit from this style of school of thought. The third most common school of thought is collaborative. Now, this is a collaborative process within a safe, comfortable environment where conductive learning is present. So this is where the teacher facilitates and the students participate back in that process. This is what we see the most common nowadays, especially going through all of our observations of teachers. We see teachers standing in the front of the classroom or maybe in the middle of the classroom, on the side of the classroom, and they will be giving the instruction or giving the lesson, but the students are giving back their feedback. And it might look like the teacher saying, give me a thumbs up, give me a thumbs down. It might be them asking leading questions and waiting for the class to respond. But it's just the teacher and the students going back and forth to understand their knowledge and for the teacher to be able to know that they're getting it and understanding your lesson. So collaborative aligns best with CLR because it lends itself to student choice, collaboration, and eventual independence. So student choice, this is where they have a little bit of freedom. They feel like they have some say in what they're learning about. Collaboration is what I was talking about with the student and teacher going back and forth. And eventual independence because over time, the students will feel more confident in their abilities and the teacher can step back a little bit and watch and see what their classroom or students can do with the knowledge that you've taught them. It garners control of the classroom for the teacher, and it provides students with an opportunity to love learning because of the facilitating that's going on between them and that teacher that they trust. So one caveat to the collaborative school of thought, however, is that it can be hard for teachers to know when it's appropriate to be authoritarian, but you still need to pull in the authoritarian side of the school of thoughts if you need to and when it's appropriate, because this quote down here says, students still need to recognize that the teacher is the final voice of authority in the classroom. So collaborative, I would say, is kind of the happy medium between the authoritarian style and the permissive style, because the permissive style, the students are in control. And in the collaborative style, students still have some kind of control. They have control over their responses, which also plays into the student choice. But it's not all the way where the teacher is fully in charge to the authoritarian side, where the students still have some leadership in the classroom. The third step of assessment before incorporating CLR into your classroom management plan is the 3Ps approach. Now, the 3Ps approach is the book's way of talking about how the environment in your classroom should be and how your aura as a teacher in general should be. So the first P, excuse me, stands for positive. Now, this is the educator must be positive in vibe and energy. Being positive in the classroom means having intangible characteristics demonstrated to their students. These characteristics can be care, empathy, kindness, humor, and most importantly, love. A positive stance in CLR, for example, could be words of affirmation, so giving praise to your students that are doing good, giving praise to those who maybe just need a little bit of extra praise that day. It all helps in creating a nice and positive environment for your classroom. The second P stands for proactive. This is when the teacher has the ability to predict potential problems and know where and when trouble can arise. Now, this has to do with knowing who your students are. And an example that the book talks about is a student who has sticky fingers, otherwise known as likes to steal. A way that a teacher can be proactive about a situation like that is knowing that student, recognizing that behavior from that student, and then making a change in the environment So it could be moving that student away from items. It could be isolating that student's desk away from other students. It could be placing that student close to your desk. That way you can keep a closer eye on them. Now, being proactive is always better than being reactive, and it'll help save your emotions in the long run. The third P here stands for preventive. This is the tactic of teacher choosing their battles with students. This can be handled through changes in classroom environment and also saves time in the long run. So this is the teacher making decision either to fight on a situation in an ongoing matter or to deal with it in a way that still gets the message across that the behavior is unacceptable, but in a way that doesn't take time and energy away from your instruction. So an example of this could be when a student maybe gets up in the middle of lessons to go get a drink of water all the time, instead of every time that student when they get up, you saying something in the middle of instruction just to that student. You can choose your battle and wait until the end of the lesson to pull that student to the side and explain to them and give them an ultimatum, maybe, if that's what it takes. And that way you don't have to take away time from your instruction that is very valued by your other students that are not doing this inappropriate behavior. Now to incorporating CLR. So once the classroom management is assessed and it is shown that the 3 R's are in place, the philosophy is collaborative, and the vibe is positive, proactive, and preventive, the steps to CLR classroom management can be fully enacted. So the next step to incorporating CLR would be to understand cultural behaviors. Now this is really, really big, especially in culturally responsive teaching, because cultural miscommunications can occur within the classroom every day. Separating cultural behaviors is a really big part in this, because teachers need to understand that students coming from a culture that does not match the culture of the school can pose a challenge for positive interactions and relationships. That is why it's important to determine a management plan for your cultural kids, because their behaviors may be seen as acceptable in their culture, but in the school culture, it's not acceptable. So an example of this is call and respond. So you may have a student coming from a culture where it's very appropriate in their schooling systems for the students to verbally speak in the middle of a teacher's lesson, like saying, oh, that makes sense, or, oh, yeah, I understand that. Now, if you do this in a culture of a school, like in American schools, the teacher might see it as talking back, talking during lesson, you're not supposed to talk when I'm talking, things like that. So having a different management plan for that culture kid will help you determine how to solve that problem, because it is going to be different than how you would solve it with an American cultured student. Separating cultural behaviors also has to do with knowing that the way people interact with each other is culturally determined and machinated by how these functions are conducted in the house, in the family, and in the community. It is important to be aware of cultural behaviors and distinguish between those and flat out wrong behaviors. So you need to know when a student is doing a behavior that they think is culturally okay versus when a student is doing a behavior that everyone knows is inappropriate. This TED Talk discusses how culture drives behaviors, and I think it is important as for future educators to know, because you need to be able to understand that different cultures have different behaviors, and if you don't know that, you're not going to be able to help out your cultural students as best as your ability, and you may force them to shut down. Any day now.
Full square in the center of that. Suddenly I was in Brussels. I was sitting on the Grand Place, which is a beautiful square in the center of town. Suddenly a man came and sat next to me and started talking to me. So I turned to him and I answered. Then I turned back and I asked myself, why is he talking to me? Suddenly I realized, Julian, you're becoming Norwegian. So I turned to the man and I said, sorry, I live in a country where people don't speak to each other. The thing is in Norway is not that people don't speak to each other, it's that socialization takes place in a much more framed and organized manner. I was not expecting this man as a stranger to come and talk to me. However, this is surprising because I come from the French-speaking part of Canada where that type of behavior is totally normal. However, my mental programming has changed. My brain has been rewired. Because during the last 5 years, I have lived in a tiny little country in the north of Europe, which is called Norway. When you move to a different country, there's 3 ways that you can relate to the culture. You can confront, complain, or conform. When you confront, you believe that your behaviors are the right behaviors. When you complain, what it happens is that you will isolate yourself into social bubbles of foreigners living in segregation with society. When you adapt your way to behave, when you conform to the whole society, then you can truly benefit from diversity. But that implies that you are observing, learning, understanding the behaviors of others, and adapting your own so that it fits with the behaviors of the society. I was in the northeast of Spain, in a beautiful region of Catalonia. And I was there with a very good friend of mine. He is 2 meters tall, long man. And we were visiting the beautiful region where they're making the kettle, the Spanish chocolate kettle. And after the guy the tour, we asked some more questions to the very charming guide that was there. And she was explaining us with passion about what she was doing. And then suddenly she stopped. She took a step aside. She took my friend. She shook him. And then she looked at me and said, why is he not interested in what I'm saying? Because she was not getting the emotional feedback she was used to. She was seeing his emotional feedback through her own cultural glasses. Meaning that she was interpreting the fact that he had a neutral face on what it would mean if someone from her culture would have that face. And that would mean that the person was not interested or didn't want to be there. And we all see the world through cultural glasses. The lens through which your brain sees the world shapes your reality. If you can change the lens, not only can you change the way your brain perceives behaviors, but you can change the way people relate to confront cultural differences. Embedded within that statement is the key to benefiting from diversity. 3 years ago, I was sitting on the board of directors of one major university in Northern Europe. And I was representing 2,000 academic staff. And I wanted to become a better leader. So I've looked around the whole university for a leadership class that would be suited to my position.
So next, we're going to talk about the examples of behaviors in the classroom and how to distinguish what is cultural and what is non-cultural, otherwise known as inappropriate. So cultural behaviors, some examples might be student is talking while teacher is talking, but in an affirming way. So like what I was talking about earlier, when the student is just maybe thinking out loud, which is perfectly acceptable in their culture, but in the culture of a school, it's not what we typically see. Another cultural behavior might be student is tapping on desk while other students are working quietly. So that student might come from a culture where music is very big. Another example is students are in a collaborative group paying attention to students in another collaborative group, or a student is assertively as opposed to aggressively talking back, trying to make a point with the teacher. Now, some non-cultural behaviors would be ones like students are picking on another student. Now, that doesn't happen in cultures, and that's how you know that it's just a flat-out inappropriate behavior from your students. Another example might be student says mean and disrespectful things to the teacher, or students that are stealing. Now, those are all examples of just flat-out inappropriate behaviors, and those behaviors can be dealt with by your normal classroom management plan, but your cultural behaviors like these ones might have their own aspects in your classroom management plan where you deal with these in a separate way and respond to them differently. Now, to continue on with separating cultural behaviors, culturally inappropriate behavior is one that is commonly in one's culture, but not in the school culture. So an example of this could be eye contact, where it's inappropriate in some cultures to make direct eye contact with someone the whole time, but in our culture, the teacher expects the students to have their eyes on the teacher on all times. So this would be just a culturally inappropriate behavior that you would have to redirect in a separate way than you would a regular culture, I shouldn't say regular, an American cultured student who knows better and still doesn't want to look at you, that you would redirect through your classroom management plan. If the behavior is wrong as opposed to culturally inappropriate, then the teacher's response should follow the regular management plan, which is what I was just talking about. It is important for teachers to have management plans for culturally inappropriate behaviors so the student can still be involved in instruction. Redirection is always better than the student missing instruction or valuable class time. CLR educators must be aware of descriptors of cultural behaviors and how they play out in the culture of the school. In this YouTube video, it talks a little bit more about separating cultural behaviors and gives a few really good examples.
If you look at behavior, one of my favorite examples is teachers who work with, I'll use Mexican American students as an example, that really don't understand why it is that when they're reprimanding children, the children won't maintain eye contact. And so that is a cultural difference. Having grown up in a Mexican American home, I know that if my parents were reprimanding me and I looked directly at them, they would consider that an act of defiance. So looking away is a way of showing respect and an indication that you recognize that what you've done is wrong. And so teachers will look at behaviors like that, judging them from their own cultural base, and make a determination that it is a behavioral issue. And so they'll begin to treat children the same way they have mental disorders. But I think the point that's important is if you look at behavior and it's common to a group, it's quite interesting as a teacher to not recognize that as a cultural difference. So it's really important for teachers may consider that to be shy, withdrawn behavior, and if it persists over time, they may think about referrals. When we have teaching act is a cultural act. It's the interaction of the culture of the teacher and the culture of the student. And if the teacher isn't aware of what the expectations are for a particular student,
So with separating cultural behaviors, it's just important to know that a behavior might be so it's important to know that this just took a bad turn. Okay. That these students aren't trying to be disrespectful or defiant. They are just from a different culture, and you need to remember that and remember to have a different management plan for your cultural kids than you do for your regular kids. Now Anna's turn.
Is it on the thing?
Yeah, the light's on. It's recording.
Okay. Okay, guys. So now we're going to talk about validating and affirming cultural behaviors through instruction. So this is just talking about when teachers need to use systematic forms of responding and discussing. They need to incorporate movement activities in the classroom so the children won't get like bored. And that's a fun way for them to interact in the classroom with activities. And there needs to be effective attention signals for procedural movements. And teachers also have to include consistent group work so the students can get to know each other and learn from a young age how to work together. So the students need daily opportunities and practice with situational appropriateness to become conversant with cultural behaviors in school. So maybe you could group students that are from different cultures so that way they can get a bigger variety and see what other cultures are available or what other cultures their peers are and get to know a little bit more about the students. So this is talking about cultural behaviors. These behaviors are culturally and linguistically determined. These are some of the behaviors that vary by culture. So some of the things that it was talking about is in different cultures, some students or some kids respect more the adults and like the teachers. Like they have to know when to start talking when someone else is talking because some students they don't have that respect. They might just blurt out some words or something. And other students might raise their hand when they have something to say. So that's one of the things that depends on different cultures. Another thing is how long students talk. So some of them might talk longer than others, but it also depends on what culture they came from. Because some students are just taught to not say, maybe not say everything they want to express. They just say what they mean to say. And another thing is that what tone is used while the the students are talking. This also is a cultural behavior because some students might be louder, and that's part of their culture because that's how they were upbringed at home. That's how they grew up and everything. And other students might in their culture might respect more the tone that they use while adults are around or other students. And some tones and the students might be different what they use at home than what is expected to use at school, because at home they might be rowdy and all this kind of stuff, but that's not acceptable at school. They need to be respectful and raise their hand, wait for their turn, and stuff like that. So this is a video talking about different culture behaviors. Oh, yeah.
Children's play preferences reflect the values that they're being raised in. Children in a more individualistic culture may prefer to spend time alone, they may prefer to spend time doing activities, they may be more caught up in individual achievement and smaller groups, exclusionary activities, whereas children raised in a collective, collaborative culture may emphasize inclusion, play larger groups, less concerning that aspect. Another way that cultures differ is the level of expressiveness that's allowed, that's encouraged. We have some children in some cultures, it's very important to mask their feelings. It's a priority in other cultures to be very expressive. That may appear to be using their crutches and aggressive in one classroom, may not be. Another way that play would vary the roles that children play. Child is learn active roles, taking care of animals, driving tractors. In a city, somebody raised in a city, maybe driving taxis and buses and enacting those kinds of roles. They're often urban areas, you see lots of children, maybe soccer moms, they driving cars and playing on their cell phones at the same time. And also, within cultural differences, we do see lots of styles and learning words that you might come across that represents another culture. Don't just know the story about it. You want to take in all the projects that are going into the songs for work. You should understand cultures and not just the simplicity of just recognize things that are being raised in. We're trying to consider values and culture because values underlie a lot of
Okay, so that was talking about different cultures that you find out in the classroom. So in the video you saw that some kids were acting up. They were like being more rowdy than the other kids that were in kind of in the background, like doing their own thing, reading a book and stuff like that. So that's a way to see the differences between those two cultures. And so you just have to be aware in your classroom what types of different cultures there are. So you can, like, if someone is very shy and doesn't want to participate or something like that, you have to be aware of those things because you don't want to like force them to do something that they're not comfortable with. So the next slide is talking about protocols, and there are two types of protocols that it talked about in the chapter. There's a macro level and a micro level protocol. And protocols are procedures and routines used in schools. And some of the The first protocols are called school-wide protocols, which include the way that students stand in line when it's time to come inside from recess. So there might be like a different system for each school or each classroom maybe. So maybe hands on your back. Maybe they stand in line with a partner. Like in this picture, it's showing the kids are holding each other's back like a train. I've seen they cross their arms to walk inside in the classroom or hands to yourself. So that's a protocol that was talked about. Um, Another protocol is how students move in common areas in the school. So there may be like different ways that teacher expects students to go from place to place. Maybe they have a hall pass, or maybe they just raise their hand and ask to go outside. Or there's like different transitions like music. They have different what's it called? Different steps. Like they have a schedule that they have to follow. And the last thing it talked about how and where to sit in the cafeteria. Some schools might be like the kids sit from grade level, they sit with their teachers in the cafeteria. So these protocols are kind of easy to follow by some students, but some are harder for the kids to get in the routine because sometimes it's hard to get into a transition. So the teachers need to have in consideration that they sometimes need to explain this to some of the students that need more redirecting on what to do. And some of these students might struggle, so the teachers might have to change some of the protocols that are expected. So the next slide talks about classroom level protocols, which is this is mostly what you do and what the teachers do individually in their classrooms. So this includes the structure of the classroom, so where you put the stuff away, what they do when they come in, like a schedule, the transitions that they go through. So it's kind of like where they sit, like at when they come to school, in the classroom, where you have set up like the library area, every activity that you have, your science area, your computer area, like all those type of stuff that are included in your classroom. Um, the other thing that I talked about is when and how the students sharpen a pencil, which was a little bit weird because I don't know. I feel like a lot of students have pencil sharpener. They don't have to get up as much and be a distraction. But that's the thing that I talked about in the chapter. So maybe the students have to raise their hand and ask before they can get up and to sharpen their pencil, or maybe it's a big distraction in the classroom. So maybe that's why they were talking about that. Also, another thing was another classroom level protocol was for the students, they have to learn like where each material goes in the classroom. So maybe at the beginning the teacher explains, oh, so this is where the art area stuff goes. This is where your backpack is gonna go. This is where your homework, where you're gonna turn it in every day. So the teacher needs to go through those steps so the student can learn where each thing goes and they can place it back in their right spot. So maybe when they do like science or they take out some games to play with. So the teacher just needs to explain and practice with the students where each item goes so they can understand where it goes and have a routine on that. Also, the teacher might have like protocol of who passes out the papers. So they might have a system that works for them, like they choose someone or whoever volunteers that day to pass out papers because sometimes everyone's going to want to do it. So the teacher needs to have a system. And also the teacher needs to know what learning materials are needed at a certain time that she's going to be teaching a certain lesson. So she needs to have those materials in hand when she needs them. And like if they're doing science or something, maybe, or math, they can, like the materials that they're going to need to like do counting or stuff like that, that she shows the students where they're at so they can have it for their resources. So some students might struggle more with these processes. So the teacher needs to take into consideration that she needs to practice them with the students every day, or how often is needed. She needs to remind them every day until they get the hang of it. And she'll need to revise them as needed for her classroom for the protocols to work for her. So the next section on the chapter 3, it was talking about ways of responding and discussing. So the first section was talking about that forms of this responding and discussing define how some cultural behaviors are conducted within a culture and a community. Also discussions. So first I talked about discussions. Discussions in class lead to increased engagement. So it's important that the teacher has the students have discussion within each other, maybe in groups, maybe with a partner, or classroom discussions like raise their hand and stuff like that. And also they need to know what protocols are appropriate for discussion. So students know what protocol is the most appropriate for the response and for the discussion. Protocols teach situational appropriateness to know what type of behavior is appropriate for the classroom discussion. So some discussion might not even apply to what they're talking about in the classroom. So this is going to teach students what's appropriate and what's not. So if you're talking about like a math problem and a student brings up, oh yeah, like I have a dog or something like that, that doesn't apply to what it's being discussed. So the teachers just need to tell the students, oh, this is not what we're talking about right now. So it's important for teachers to include discussions in the classroom every day or as much as needed. And the other thing that it talked about was responding. So responding is used by teachers to communicate to students how the facilitator or teacher wants them to respond with questions, instruction as a whole. So this is talking about so when they want the students to respond, like if the teacher is giving a lesson, you might not want the students to interact while you're doing the lesson. So you might ask them, oh, wait till you, and or give me your responses at the end of class, or write it down, stuff like that. So involuntary ways of responding encourage accountability and engagement by the learner. So you want to give like equal opportunity for all the students to respond to what is being asked from you or to give their opinions. So you want to engage them and give them like encouragement for everyone to participate, because some students might not want to, but you want to make sure that they're engaged in the conversation so they're not left alone. So this is a way that it provides an effective feedback about the student to the teacher. So maybe by the way they're responding, it tells the teacher that, oh yes, they're learning the material that's being taught. Or they might need like they might respond with the teacher and she'll be like, oh, maybe I need to explain this more to the student until he gets it. and make sure that it also gives feedback about if they're listening and how they're understanding the material. So the last thing, ways of responding are used to explicitly communicate to students how the facilitator wants them to respond to questioning instruction as a whole group. So this is kind of like the first bullet point. So this is just showing the teacher that how they're communicating the information with other students or with them. See if it's making sense how they're explaining everything to maybe their group, that they're understanding, that they're on the same page and stuff like that. So we're going to talk about attention signals, and these are some attention signals that are used in the classroom. So attention signals are cultural resonance, which provides students with something relatable while getting their attention. So the attention signals take place when students are discussing and collaborating in the classroom. So an example that I've seen, it's the teacher claps their hands and then the students have to repeat what the teacher just did. Maybe she flicks off the lights. And they talked about that. Sometimes the flicking the lights is a good idea at the beginning, but then the students don't care anymore and they're not as engaged because they're over it. So you have to think about the effective attention signals that are going to work in your classroom. Maybe try a few different ones before you choose. So the teachers, it's important that the teachers know when to use the signals, timing is correctly, and to not overuse them. Maybe change it up if you're going to use the clapping method, maybe change it up a few times so the students won't get bored and not want to engage in those stuff. Maybe use signals that are relatable to the students, maybe something that they enjoy. So some of the examples on attention signals that are effective were found on our book on page 164 to 170. So one of the teaching signals was called student call. So that's when the teacher calls the name of the class and the students respond with woohoo, or that's who we are. So that's a good way to getting your students engaged. So another one is called when I move, you move. This can be used as a transition for students who are getting materials out or going on another place in the classroom. Teacher calls out or raps, when I move, you move, and the students call back. Just like that. So that's like the song, you know? When I move, you move, just like that. So that's a fun way for like a transition. That's a fun way for the students to get engaged. So I'm going to show you a video. This is showing different transitions that or attention signals that can be used in the classroom.
An attention signal is a visual and/or auditory cue to gain student attention. Without an effective attention signal, transitions won't go smoothly. Choose a location in your classroom where you will regularly give the attention signal. Class, may I have your attention, please? Choose a cue that's both visual and auditory. 1, 2, 3, eyes on me.
So you saw in the video that it's very important for you to establish attention signals in your classroom and practice with the students so they can get a hang of it. Also, um, you need to sometimes give them rewards or reinforce those signals. And if they're not listening to you or something like that, maybe try something different, or like they said in the video, give them a mild consequence. So these are attention signals that are mostly used during transitions because you want to get the students' attention while they're being engaged with other students. So you might want to try those attention signals during that time. So the last slide talks about movement activities, and movement activities are a great way also to engage students in the classroom. Movement activities help decrease management issues in the classroom. So if you're having like rowdy kids, maybe include a movement activity like a math movement activity, like do 5 jumping jacks or stuff like that. So the students will get back engaged with the classroom and what you're doing. So this is a great way to increase student engagement in the activities that are happening in the classroom. This movement activity also help provide additional input to the brain. So this is helping the student's brain, and it enhances the learning. So there are different movement activities you can include in the classroom. Maybe do them as a group or do them as individual. Maybe like stand up and give high fives to the students next to you. So I'm going to show you guys a video of movement activities that can be used in the classroom. Are they closing? Okay, so that was the last of the slide. So just make sure that if you include movement activities in your classroom, you have enough room and your classroom is set up to include those activities because you're gonna have a lot of movement. And in the video, it showed how the students really enjoy doing math and movement. So maybe have feedback on what the students like and everything. So that's the end for this chapter 3.